Hello, and welcome to Ask Tell number 16. I'm Adam Kadri. This time around, we're diving into the interactive fiction of the year 2007. So let's get to it. So in episodes 14 and 15, we covered The Baron by Victor Heispers, and here's his follow-up game, Fate, which won the 2007 Spring Thing competition. And back to talk about it with me is Amy Hill. She was actually the last guest to appear on the show prior to the hiatus, but that was 6 years ago, so I reckon reintroductions are in order.
I'm Amy Ray Hill, and I'm an artist for a living. I paint space pottery like teapots and mugs and yarn bowls with lots of various nebulae, galaxies, Martian landscapes, lots of different things. And I think last time I was here, that was kind of more of a hobby, and I was an art teacher more full time. But since the pandemic happened, I basically lost the bulk of my teaching gig with the shutdown of the schools. So pivoted to doing art full time. And so it's a little bit of reverse to where I was back in 2018. And I still have a little time to play IF in my spare time.
Okay, so that last chunk of spare time went to Fate. What's this one about?
In Fate, you play as Catherine, who is a queen, and she's only like 20, and she's 9 months pregnant. She's about to pop, and she is in her castle. The first thing you encounter is your crystal ball, where it looks like you are going to be bit by a snake and killed. And from there, you go on to the future where your child is born. And you also see that someone is coming in to assassinate your child. And it turns out it looks like it is your brother-in-law, Harold. So someone who's trying to remove the heir so that they can have their place at the throne. And so what you have to do is go through the castle and the castle grounds to try and manipulate people around you and cast spells in order to change the fate of your son, they say in the game. And so the question comes, are you able to change that fate, and what kind of fate can you bring for the future of your child?
And on top of that is the question of what you're willing to do to change that fate. There are puzzles in this game, as you have to figure out how to collect all the ingredients you need for your spells. But the heart of this game is not the puzzles, but the ethical question of how far you'll go to achieve your goals, especially when your goals are not personal power, the way they are in, say, Varicella, but to save the life of your child. So it presents questions like whether you... All right, I guess this might need a little setup. So one of the strengths of this game is that it's good at parceling out discoveries. New areas unlock as you make progress, so the map grows over time, but it never gets overwhelming. And there is some neat stuff to find. Like early on, you walk into your other room and there's like a bird cage, except it contains a pixie. And it's like, gadzooks, I've got my own Tinkerbell. And then it turns out that the reason you have a pixie is so you can cut off her wings to use in magic spells. And the game says, oh, but they grow back quickly, so it's an inexhaustible resource. And yeah, it's painful and she cries, but you need them for your spells, and she's good as new within a few days. So that's one of the first big moral choices you have to make. Will you cut the wings off a pixie? And my sense is that the reason that there are puzzles in this game at all is that when Victor had tried doing an ethics game the previous year, The Baron, it just had you pick options in a menu-based philosophical dialogue. And I guess that for a lot of players, that sort of fell flat. So maybe he was thinking, all right, how can I do the same sort of thing in a more traditional way with puzzles?
Maybe I'm not the right player for that then, because I am a very casual IF player. And so I am not really that great at puzzles. And so when we get into things like puzzles, there's a lot of them, I feel like, in the story where you have to figure out certain spells to cast. And to me, it feels a little cumbersome because they're all in this grimoire in your den, but you can't take it with you. I'm guessing it's really, really heavy, which makes sense. But I ended up like leaving 2 games open so I could like access that and check what I needed to cast, the different ingredients I need to pick up around the castle to get through it. So I felt like that was, for me, just a little tedious figuring out what ingredients I needed and which spell to cast next.
I could see that an effort was being made to get rid of some of the tedium, When I found the Pixie's cage, I typed open cage, and the game said it was locked, and I thought, oh no, it's another one of these IF puzzles where I have to go find a key, and why wouldn't I just already know where the key is? Like, I own the cage. But I was pleasantly surprised to find that when you look at the desk, it says, this is the desk where you keep the key to the Pixie's cage. And I thought, hey, we're making progress. The game is telling me things my character wouldn't have to figure out.
I suppose it could be a lot worse. I guess it's maybe someone's cup of tea, but it wasn't my favorite sort of thing, I guess, in terms of gameplay. I would like to more so focus on that element of what moral level will you go to or will you bring yourself down to change your fate. But I felt like I couldn't get there because I was spending so much time figuring out that I needed to like cut the rose rather than take the rose, or all these little things that kind of got in the way of that for me.
Yeah, that's another thing. Unfortunately, this definitely could have used a more thorough playtesting pass, because cut the rose versus take the rose is not a puzzle. That's just bad programming.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran into a lot of the same issues, not even in trying to solve puzzles, but just looking at objects. There's a room that's full of tapestries, and to look at them, I tried X tapestry, hoping that the game would reply something like, which tapestry do you mean? The one with the castle on it, or the one with the comet on it, or something to indicate which tapestry was which? But instead it just said I couldn't see any such thing. But when I tried X tapestries, plural, that was implemented. And making sure that you implement both the plural and the singular is pretty basic stuff. But oversights are going to happen. That's why you need playtesters. And yeah, you might want to bring in some random people so you can find out how to make it friendlier to IF newcomers. But you also need to recruit some IF experts who know how to find these oversights before you release your game.
I think it's kind of a big barrier for entry for a lot of people who come to it later, because you don't always intuitively know, maybe I should use this verb or that one if it's not covered in the playtesting. And so for that reason, it can be a little hard, even if the commands are well implemented. But I wanted to also point out, like, those elements, in addition to the moral choices that you're making. What I mean by like the moral choices, plucking the pixie's wings or killing the snake, I didn't want to do either of those, honestly, and kind of being forced into making one of those two choices to advance the plot. It doesn't feel like a choice that I would make, so it makes me not really care about the outcome as much. Because I feel like one of the main strengths of IF is that you kind of get to play as yourself. You're, whoever you are cast as the main character, but you're always treated as you. It's the second person. You get to decide your choices. And I would have liked a variety of choices as I'm making my way along this game a little bit more, even though maybe it was making a statement about how much violence you're willing to commit. It's not a choice I would ever make in real life, so it was hard to be invested in that.
I forget whether I've already talked about this on this show, but have you ever played, or are you familiar with, Undertale?
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't played it.
So that was a game that a bunch of people told me that everyone should play, and that I in particular should play, because it's doing all sorts of interesting stuff with interactive narrative, but it's also kind of retro, just like IF, so check it out. So I did, and it's been a while now, so I don't remember all the details, but pretty early on, your guardian says, I have to take care of something, but stay put, don't leave, and I'll be back soon. But then she doesn't come back. And it turns out that the idea behind the game is that nothing will happen unless you're disobedient and leave. So your choice is either be disobedient, rebel against your guardian, or just sit there forever as the game fails to progress. Or, obviously, quit the game. And I chose option 3. There's a movie called Funny Games that I haven't seen, but I have heard about. And apparently the idea is that some psychopaths break into a house and torture and murder an entire family, while occasionally turning to the camera and asking, why are you watching this? Is this your idea of entertainment? So you have to make a choice and either acknowledge that, yes, it is your idea of entertainment, or else turn it off and miss the rest of the movie. And Undertale seemed to me to have the same sort of mechanism. You either have to do this thing that I didn't want to do, or miss the rest of the game. And I was like, oh, so that's how this works? Okay, done with Undertale. And one thing I appreciated about Fate was that it doesn't have exactly the same structure. It doesn't make you either do the nasty thing or quit the game. You always have the option to go back to your den and explicitly accept your fate as shown in the crystal ball at that time. And I think you and I both chose to end in the same place, right? We both went with the life in poverty ending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Save yourself, save the baby, but don't do most of the nasty stuff. And again, I appreciated that it was an explicit choice to hit the button to accept this fate rather than to have to either do the nasty things or quit the game.
It just feels disappointing to me because I just felt like there could be so many other creative ways to go about situation, and you could choose not to be violent, but it kind of says you have to go this route or just let things happen, which can be a statement in itself, is like you're living in a violent time with a violent world and you have to do these things in order to make a change. But to me, it felt rather limiting.
Yeah, I feel like this is a trope I grew up seeing in superhero stories. The villain says, haha, you can save your fiance or this bus full of innocent people, but not both. And the hero has to find a third option so everyone lives. And I gather that a lot of the idea behind Fate, the game, not the concept, is that sometimes there is no third way. In a superhero story, there can be a way to escape the double bind because the author says so, but that's not always how life works.
Yeah. And I guess that leads me to the very end of the game and that final choice you have to make. Is it okay if we go there?
Sure, please do. Though after I accepted the poverty fate, I didn't actually play to the end, so I don't actually know what that final choice is.
It very much encourages you to keep casting these spells to change the fate in the crystal ball. And so you're casting a spell that conjures up a demon, and basically he says you have to make a choice on, how you decide to change the fate of your child. And you have to make this final sacrifice, which is you're going to give up your own life and die in childbirth to change the fate of your child, to give them something different than this life of poverty. And the one line that just really struck a nerve with me was sacrifice for your family. Like, could you forgive yourself if you did not make it? And it really just struck me as, like, first of all, very predictable for making a woman have to die in childbirth to save her child. Like, that's literally what happens all the time in media. It just doesn't feel very innovative. But the other thing is, it just strikes me as something someone would ask who has never been casually asked to give up their life for someone else. When, like, it's 2024 and, it's one thing to see the news and know how women are losing rights and people with uteruses losing their rights, repealing Roe v. Wade, and just seeing, like, all of that disappearing before our eyes that was secure and protected before, and that we get guilted into preserving someone else's life over our own all the time in that way. But to see that happening in legislature and stuff is one thing, but to also experience it firsthand is another. And I've been very open online talking about, like, I've been dealing with the medical industry lately and dealing with my uterine fibroids for the past 4 months or so, and kind of just getting this general sense from the way you're not treated as a priority in just the general public or the medical world over your ability to reproduce, your fertility, and things like that. So when you're faced with treatment options, it's all about how to preserve that fertility, not your comfort. Like, there's a lot of pain involved in treatment, and no one ever says, like, I'm sorry, or how are you doing about it? It's just one thing after another that kind of culminates in a message telling you that your quality of life does not matter. Ultimately, it's telling you that, like, your life does not matter, and your fertility is the focus in a lot of ways. So it kind of just really struck me as something that was not a question I would ever feel like is a fun one to encounter in a game. So for me, that was just not a question I wanted to be asked in that very, like, condescending tone of that little troll. And it felt like it was really directing things there. So I backed out and undid my choices, and I didn't want to kill the goat anyway in that last spell. So I just waited for my fate. And I honestly felt like that was the wrong choice to make, because there's nothing to encourage you to just wait for it. Everything is encouraging you to, like, take the next step and make that spell and make the fate change, because that's going to be the exciting answer. But just waiting it out, you get to have your life of poverty, and it happens just like it does in the crystal ball, which leaves you with a question of whether you feel fear or hope. And at the very least, I got to press hope. There was no conclusive congratulations on fixing your state of affairs at your castle. Like now you at least have freedom in the real world beyond the castle walls, even though that might be a little bit too much handing you the narrative. But like it would have been nice for the author to make some sort of stance or like statement in that way at the very end.
All right, lots of stuff to respond to there. So first of all, I want to say I'm very sorry you've had to go through all that. You know, we've talked about it offline, but since you mentioned it on the show, I did want to express my sympathies on the show. Obviously, I've never experienced the same thing you have firsthand. Secondhand, I have been in the room to provide support when someone very close to me has been put through some of the same procedures. And I mean, I've heard it said that there's a double standard in medicine in that gynecological patients are expected to have a significantly higher pain tolerance than people undergoing other types of procedures. And I'm not qualified to do the compare and contrast, but I can say that even vicariously, what I've seen behind the door that says women's medicine has been traumatic. And I found that there's a callousness about this among some of the doctors I've seen in action. In my literature classes, we used to look at a Hemingway story from exactly 100 years ago now, in which an obstetrician says, "Her screams are not important." And it seems like maybe things haven't changed that much in 100 years. And maybe you have to cultivate some callousness if your patients are regularly crying on the table like a pixie getting her wings ripped off. But I can't help but feel like if the demographics were different, there might be more impetus to do something about that suffering.
Yeah, like through all of this, it struck me that, you're right. There's like a different level of pain tolerance you're expected to have. The biopsy I had didn't come back conclusive. So I'm worried for at least a month about the results of that. And nobody even bothers to say, like, I'm sorry we had to put you through all this pain for like absolutely no payoff. And so it just feels like no one has the knowledge, no one has the sensitivity, and there isn't even like in research, like women haven't even been mandated that we're included in clinical trials since like 1993 was the first year that was made a law. And that's just wild to me that like we don't even have any knowledge on why our medical issues begin or how to prevent them. And so all of that just compounds together and it just makes it very, very hard to be a woman in the medical stuff.
I guess one way to frame the issue is that in 2016, I went to the hospital with a flare-up of kidney pain. And I did have to spend an hour gritting my teeth in the waiting room, filling out my insurance information and all that. But once they actually got around to treating me, the first thing they did was hook me up to an IV and give me some Toradol. And I don't understand why they wouldn't do the same thing before performing excruciating procedures at a gynecologist's office.
Just tell you, take some Advil, take some ibuprofen, take some naproxen. We're not going to give you anything, though. I actually went in there and asked, like, are we going to be, like, numbing anything? And they were like, no, not really. It's like, okay. It's wild how different that is.
Yeah. Well, this could be a whole episode of its own, but to turn to another one of the points that you just made, one thing I can speak about firsthand is what it's like to be a guy in your mid-20s and to think, I don't want to write another game about crawling around in a cave or fixing a broken spaceship. I want to write about something that matters to me, like the systematic mistreatment of women and girls. Even though, as a guy in my mid-20s, I wasn't exactly capable of writing the feminine mystique. So instead I came up with a game of palace intrigue with edgelordy details in Varicella, and a game in which you enter the fractured mind of a family patriarch who's raping his daughter in Shrapnel. And a few years later, here's Victor Heispers with The Baron, a game in which you enter the fractured mind of a family patriarch who's raping his daughter, and now Fate, a game of palace intrigue with edgelordy details like the Pixie. But based on Rachel's reaction to The Baron, and now your reaction to Fate, it seems like maybe these games missed the mark. So, what's your take? Points for trying? Or is this a case of not this author's story to tell?
You do have to consider your identity in terms of the story you're telling. Are you telling a story that is from your understanding of the world? And is it a story you should tell? Are you the right person to talk about these choices a woman has? And to be fair, personally, I appreciate when people at least make an effort to make moral questions a point of their game and to dig into it. That's why I'm taking the time to talk about it because I enjoy him as a writer. And I think that it was 2007, and it was definitely a time where you weren't having as many diverse people writing games or even identities of the players in the games. So it's a good effort, but like there's still a lot of shortcomings as you see Catherine go around and interact with each of the men in the castle. I think he really attempted for accuracy with how a woman might get past a very strong guard or something like that. She's not going to just like beat him up or something. She might encourage him to tell stories of bravery and talk about how he like slayed a dragon or something and then deceive him in some way. In this game, you have to put something in his drink and then he falls asleep. But at the same time, you do also have to convince another one that you are an idiot, basically. You're stupid, and you're just playing with a teddy bear in front of him to get him to be convinced that you're not going to know anything about the maps that you see when you enter the room. And it's weird to play as a woman in a game where it's written by a guy and he's telling you to enact these stereotypes of how a woman would be seen in a man's eyes in order to advance the plot. I think if you exchange gender with race, it would be a lot less accepted. I would never think to write a game where, I was having a character of color have to perform racist stereotypes to advance the plot. And for some reason, I guess having a woman do that, it seems like it's more acceptable or something. But it just kind of made me feel a little uncomfy. There's the fine line between accuracy of a portrayal and a stereotype. And I think sometimes it goes more towards like stereotypes.
I think one of the issues here is that this is fantasy, but it's faux medieval fantasy. And if you want to write about anything in any historical period, including the 20th century, you're going to be anachronistic if you don't depict the subjugation of women throughout society. I remember that about a dozen years ago or so now, a number of companies seemed to realize that, hey, there's this little group of authors who now have decades of experience creating interactive narrative. And we'd like to get into that space, so let's try bringing them on board. And I got some inquiries, and one of the companies I checked out had put out a statement saying that if you're going to write in a historical period for that company, your game must take place in an alternate universe with gender equality. And I mean, I get it, insofar as a game is supposed to be fun, and it's a lot more fun to spend time in a more egalitarian world. But by that logic, you'd also have to say that your historical fiction can't have kings or queens in it because royalty certainly isn't egalitarian. And this goes beyond just a question of preferences in entertainment, because at some point you're contributing to a distorted view of history, and that has real-world consequences. A lot of our political problems these days stem from a desire to return to the past among people who don't understand what the past was like.
I think they're going at it like the wrong way, because I think you can still have an understanding of a society that treats women as lesser than or gives them fewer choices. But you can also make characters that don't just follow your stereotype of what you think their choices would be, that they would make. So there's the character who can make a choice, and then there's the way that they can be treated. So I think that you can still have them face obstacles, but maybe go about their obstacles a different way or a more fully human way than just the way you think a woman might make a choice.
Yeah, you have to be very careful when you write something like this, as I know firsthand from stuff like Varicella and Shrapnel, because it's easy to say, oh, I've created this world where women are beaten down at every turn in order to show how bad it is. And you can be totally sincere about that. And yet you can't get away from the fact that, to some extent, you're offering up the opportunity to spend time in this world as entertainment. And the more heavy-handed you are about guiding the audience away from misinterpreting your intentions, the worse the story is going to be. So it's a delicate balance.
Right. I definitely don't think his motives were to like enjoy the way the woman was in her place and had to maneuver that way, but like it just kind of came across that way. And I think it was funny, just like as I was trying to get past Charles and we're trying to like let him go through all of his wild encounters and his battles and stuff like that. And I'm just trying to type like, just stab Charles. We can just get rid of him that way. But that was not an option. It said you were not allowed to do that. So I'm just thinking as a woman, I'm just being thwarted by any other attempt to do anything else. But it's interesting, an interesting relationship from the author of a game to the player of the game, and what kind of dynamics you're trying to set up within the game too.
Right. As an author, that's one of those fundamental game design questions you have to answer every time you start a new project, consciously or not. Like if the player says, jump out the window, what do you say? Do you say, okay, you died, game over? Or do you prevent it somehow? The problem with preventing it is that, as you say, players can feel thwarted or feel that the game is on rails. But allowing it has its own problems. Not only is allowing everything harder to program, but it can actually take players out of the game because a lot of them will start trying more and more outlandish stuff just to see what might happen. But I said that your comments from a few minutes ago had a lot to respond to, and there actually was one more thing you brought up that I wanted to talk about. As we've mentioned, we both wound up going for the same ending, and, as you said, you're told that you embark on a life free from the castle with your child still alive, but you're both beggars. And the game asks you whether you feel fear or hope. And it turns out that your response doesn't matter. Whichever one you pick, the game basically just says, okay, the end. So, like the Baron, this turns out to be another game of choices without feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like this must be a big part of the author's agenda. That he's trying to get players to stop thinking about feedback. The reward shouldn't be this external stimulus, but the internal reward of thinking about it for yourself. But I don't know. I'm not really on board with that.
It kind of feels like a cop-out. Like, you don't have to do the work of making a statement. You just let other people playing the game make their own conclusion. Yeah, and I think just to hit the title again, the premise is to see if you can change fate, and it's kind of posed as more of a question, which I guess, you shouldn't necessarily assume it can be changed. I thought that would be a lot more interesting if we had more of a branching story. I thought that's kind of what the game was going to be, but it really wasn't quite as branching as I thought, or at least what I saw in the game. It seemed like the only solution for the way I wanted to play the game was to just wait out my fate. I didn't want to have to make the choices to make the necessary changes of my fate. So I think ultimately it did feel a little limiting, and I thought there could be a lot more to a game about fate.
I didn't necessarily need more branches, but I thought that the reward mechanism of the game was going to be that you would consider your options, select the fate that you want based on the ethical choices you're willing to live with, and then receive a little vignette as an epilogue. That's how Emily Short's float point worked. You have about a dozen choices for what message you want to send to a group of colonists on an alien planet, and for each possible choice, you get a different scene to bring the story to a conclusion. Each one's about 2 pages long. And, as in The Baron, it seems like the young Victor Heispers was opposed to the idea of providing these sorts of rewards. Maybe the idea was that they undermine the weight of the big choice because players might try every option just to see all the endings. But this is another game in which you make your big choice and then the game says, okay. The concluding text is actually less detailed than what you see in the crystal ball. Yep, you're poor. Bye-bye.
Right. Yeah, for making moral choices, you would think that the ending would take more of a stance one way or the other, or give you more of a conclusion to your choices.
Yeah, it seems like a big part of the agenda here is to say, it's not up to me as an author to say what's a good outcome and what's a bad outcome. Instead, here are some questions to ponder on your own time. It reminded me of the way a middle school reading textbook will give you a short story followed by a set of questions to think about.
Yeah, like I said earlier, it would have been more brave, I think, to make a stance one way or the other on which ones were positive versus negative or what they meant.
So I reckon that's all I have to say about this one. Any final thoughts?
For me, I'm not a big magic fantasy person, and I'm not sure why I picked this game in the first place because it definitely advertises like fantasy. But yeah, ultimately, I like his writing style. I like the author, and it just felt like this is a product of its time in terms of female representation in a game with a good attempt to understand the way a woman might maneuver herself in a hostile world. But yeah, kind of fell short in some ways for me. And some of that was the puzzle element. Some of it was just the characterization of who you're playing as. The game really does focus a lot on your son's fate and not your own fate, even though, as we pointed out, the first vision in the crystal ball, you're both being murdered by the snake. So It is still a little disappointing to not really have much of a focus on that, which kind of made that sting a little more, that last choice of guilting you into giving up your life for your child, because there never really was a focus on your well-being in this entire game, which I think is definitely half of the challenge. Like, you want your child to survive and have a good life, but what about your own life? It just seems like something women have to accept throughout their whole existence, is to just put themselves second or not even put themselves as a priority at all. So that was, I think, kind of disappointing. Your one good ending, you get to be a marble statue, which kind of is another trope of like women can just be remembered as whatever the men around them want them to be remembered as.
Next up, we have Varkana by Mariam Goucher-Forgeot. Varkana won the 2007 Zizzy Award for Best Setting. And back to talk about it with me is Rachel K. Jones. So what's the deal with this one?
Varkana is a science fantasy game by Mariam Goucher-Forgeot about what happens in the eponymous city-state of Varkana when a party of ambassadors from the distant land of Ashtarta come for a visit. Our heroine is the book crafter Faranaz, who has been tasked by her mentor with repairing an antique poetry book. Faranaz has been warned to watch for members of the Ember Order who may be traveling with the diplomatic envoys, and she has been told that they may take an interest in the book and attempt to nab it if they come across it. And sure enough, in the course of her day, Faranaz discovers that one of the ambassadors is indeed trying to steal the book.
So Varkana took 6th place in the 2007 comp, which normally wouldn't be enough to secure it a place on this show. But I thought I'd include it because it did win the Zizzy for Best Setting. So, what did you make of that setting?
I could see that there was a lot of TLC put into the setting. It felt very cozy, and just how the elements of the setting were chosen. It's got this very stereotypical vacation town thing going, where there's vineyards and like elaborate baths and an area where you go shopping and an epic library. It kind of reminded me of right at the height of the pandemic in 2020. I remember really enjoying stories that had settings like this because of like that escapist, luxurious sort of feel where you're just somewhere where everything is sort of nice and vacation-ish. I liked how the story had this focus on these little moments that complemented that setting. So, you've got this cozy bed you wake up in. There's berries that the character can taste. There's her best friend is getting an herbal hair mask by the pool. And for me, when I think about the setting of this book, that's what I enjoyed most about it. There was also quite a bit in the story about the geopolitical situation. Varkana is a city-state, and it's sort of a tiny little peaceful place surrounded by more aggressive neighbors. And there was a lot about this, but it didn't really grab me so much. Like, there's characters who had mentioned things about this, but for me, it didn't evoke a sense of place the way that maybe some of the design of the town did. What did you think?
This is probably going to sound weird, but I was reminded of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. That was my favorite book when I was 5, and it's acclaimed for its setting, and you can see why. It's got all these interesting locations like the chocolate room and the squirrel room and the TV room. And like you mentioned, Varkana's got its spa and its library and its park. But what struck me when I reread Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as an adult was that Roald Dahl's descriptions tend to just say, "Oh, it was all so marvelous, and the children looked around at how marvelous everything was." It reminded me of how many years ago now, when my girlfriend at the time was looking for an apartment, she found a listing that had a good location and affordable rent and all the amenities she wanted, but it didn't have a description and it didn't have any pictures. So she wrote to the landlady to ask for more information, and the landlady wrote back, "It is very nice." That's it. 4-word email. And unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the locations in the Varkana game had the same sentiment. For instance, you mentioned waking up in the cozy bed. In my notes here, I actually wrote down what the game says about that. It says, "Sitting on your bed, you stretch your limbs and yawn, inhaling the fresh mountain air which is entering your sunny room from the window which you left open last night. The breeze is cool, tempting you to crawl back under your warm bedsheet, but the sunlight's warmth on your skin is equally inviting." And, that gets the job done. It gets across that it's sunny with fresh air coming in, and your imagination can fill in the sensory details. But there's nothing in that description that makes me think, wow, that setting is worthy of note. By contrast, look at the game that won the Zizzy for Best Setting the previous year, Float Point by Emily Short. That game also has a bedroom, and it's one of the least interesting locations in the game. Its description says, everything is on a smaller scale in the private quarters. There's no real bed, only a stone platform, too short to accommodate your full height, in the center of the room. The sole gesture toward comfort is a pillow of Earth style, perhaps left here by Valenti. A rich person's bedroom. People who paid for space would tuck the bed against the wall and not let it waste the whole room. So that's also a pretty straightforward description. No colorful metaphors or anything. But it does give us some intriguingly alien furniture and an interesting observation about how the placement of that furniture allows us to deduce socioeconomic class. And that does a lot more for me than just saying it's sunny with fresh air.
That's interesting. It reminds me of something that one of my favorite authors, Charlie Jane Anders, once said about setting, which is that she likes to treat setting descriptions as little stories. So setting should give you a sense of a story that's happened in that location or suggest something about the characters who've been there before. And I think that's the distinction you're getting at.
Charlie Jane Anders, I know that name. Where do I know it? New Mutants. She wrote New Mutants.
Yes, she did. Yep.
Anyway, that pretty much is what I'm getting at. One of the tricks you can use in writing room and object descriptions is to use it as an opportunity to trigger some backstory. Like, you walk into the chapel and you remember that this is where your brother was assassinated on his wedding day. And even more often, you can use these descriptions to tell you something about the player character. Like, what does that character consider worthy of notice? How do the items listed in a room reflect that character's mentality? Like, you walk into the family room. So, is that a TV? Or is it an OLED 4K flat screen with HDR? Or is it a confusing box? And it's entirely possible that I missed a lot, but I don't recall the setting descriptions telling me that much about Foreign Oz.
And that could be why I get that feeling of vacation town from this, because hotels and resorts are, by definition, designed to be very generically luxurious. And the problem in the story is that you're right, that even when Farnaz wakes up in this very luxurious room, the problem is that she's a resident of this town. Like, she lives here, and we don't really get that sense of lived-inness that you would expect from a resident of the town. Now, if we were in the point of view of the ambassadors, maybe some of this would be appropriate, but then you would get maybe a sense of foreignness. Like, you might draw a contrast between how a hotel would look in their land versus how the hotel looks in this new place they're visiting. I remember at one point visiting Germany and staying in a hotel where there was a full-size bed, but instead of having a full-size comforter, there were two duvets that were like one person size lying side by side on the bed. And to me, that looked very foreign and very unusual, even in a generic hotel, for like how you were expected to use this bed. And so there's not a lot of that in Varkana.
And I guess that goes a long way toward explaining why so many of the top games from 06 had you playing an ambassador, rather than someone from a place that's receiving ambassadors like this one.
It reminds me of how it's a really common device in a lot of different stories to have a naive character be the point of view character for the audience. Like Luke Skywalker in Star Wars starts off as the young, naive boy from this nowhere planet who's now going to go into adventure. And that point of view works because then people are expected to explain things to this character, which gives the author lots and lots of ways to communicate information without it being just a big data dump. So I can see why that would be a really convenient plot device in interactive fiction.
All right, well, there's more to Varkana than just the setting, so what'd you think of the other elements?
I am going to totally admit that there was all this geopolitical stuff in the game, and I found myself just clicking past it. And my problem isn't that I don't enjoy those sorts of stories. Like, I really do love a good political thriller or any story that engages really deeply with politics. But my problem was that there wasn't any really clear hooks through Farah Naz's point of view into this story because she's a book repair person. And for her, the only consequence of the visitors is just this warning that someone in that group might steal one of the books for some reason that isn't really explained. So the story puts all this weight on this political situation happening, but there aren't a lot of stakes in it for the character that you're supposed to connect with. There's all of this weight on the significance of repairing this poetry book, but you're never actually given any chance to do any book repairing. And instead, you're just sent around on little fetch quests for different people that aren't really connected with the stakes of the game or the stakes of why this book is important or even this identity as a book repair expert. And so you just kind of end up wandering around randomly, kind of looking for things to do. And I really, really wanted these puzzles to be more directly connected to just anything that Farah Naz wants.
Yeah, Varkana starts off promisingly enough. You're in the middle of a caper, you're helping your friend peek over a wall so she can report on what she sees, and she sees ambassadors and local dignitaries having what looks like a very important meeting. And that turns out to be the prologue. And then the real game gets started as you go home, you get a good night's sleep, you wake up, and then you don't actually have any tasks. So at that point, Varkana devolves into one of those games whose premise is you are in a place. You're just wandering around with no particular agenda. The first time I played this, I tried to give it an honest go with no walkthrough, and I wandered around trying to explore the whole map and wait for some dramatic event to give me a goal. And after 90 moves, I still had no motivation. I don't know, is this what the big gamers call a walking simulator?
Yeah, kind of, sort of, but I think that the good walking simulator games actually do a better job of leading you into the stakes of the story. So it's almost like a walking simulator minus the signposts, I guess.
So then I did resort to the walkthrough, but it turned out to be a walkthrough that, with one exception that I'll talk about later, was about getting you to the ending most efficiently rather than presenting you with the best version of the story. For instance, it has you go to a park and stick your hand into a bush, where it turns out that there's a ribbon, which you then use to capture a cat. Why are you doing any of this? I don't know. Now, much later, someone asks you to get some kingberries to make ink, and maybe that would give you the impetus to search the bushes. But as the walkthrough stands, when you get asked to find the kingberries, it's like, hey, funnily enough, I did that 100 turns ago.
It's kind of a missed opportunity with the ribbon, isn't it? Because there's so many other ways that could have been embedded organically in the environment that would have made that slightly more satisfying to solve. If, it could have been in the bedroom at the beginning. It could have been in like a decoration for this big party that they're putting on. It could have been literally any other thing than just being a piece of trash that you find inside a bush that you reach into.
Well, this is how IF puzzles used to work. The example I always bring up is a comp game from 1997 called A Good Breakfast. See, at some point in that game, in order to eat the good breakfast, you need a spoon. So you wander around looking for a spoon, and, as in the Matrix, there is no spoon. But then at some point you run across a robot, and the robot randomly challenges you to a game of Lights Out. So you play Lights Out with the robot, and if you win, the robot says, "Congratulations, here's your prize," and the prize is a spoon. And it wasn't just the bad games that were like this. One of the best games of 1996 was called Lost New York, but it pretty much worked the same way. Like, at one point you need a screwdriver. So, in the city of New York, surely you can find a hardware store, right? Well, no, because this is the IF New York. So instead you go to a deli, and the deli has a barrel of pickles, and you reach in to get a pickle, and what you pull out is a screwdriver. So Varkana is part of a long tradition. But I wonder how much of the audience in 2007 was still a part of that tradition. And to be fair, I vaguely recall that later there was some sort of explanation, like a little girl got her hair ribbon snagged in the bush. But just like with the ink, the walkthrough puts the clue after the solution. The other thing I didn't understand about the walkthrough, and this is the exception that I mentioned earlier, is that it seems to want you to go from location to location and ask every character you find about 15 different things. But I have no idea why, because out of those 15 things, 14 of them would always have very perfunctory responses. Like, at one point I was supposed to ask Nivanen, the friend character, about a priest. And she says, I shouldn't say this, but I think he's a bit too rigid. Or if you ask her about Hutan, a librarian, she says, you know him better than I. It's like the author wanted to show off, look, I implemented all these questions and all these answers. But they're not actually interesting. And I don't expect every character to have 200 interesting responses to conversation topics. I mean, we can't all be Emily. But a good walkthrough provides you with the optimal story, and a story stuffed to the gills with bland chit-chat is not optimal.
I am realizing just now that the walkthrough was written by the author. That makes all of that stuff make way more sense to me, because I had run into that aspect too of the conversations, and you're right that like not all of it in the walkthrough paid off.
Ultimately, the walkthrough didn't even work for me, because at one point it said to go east and talk to Nivanen, and she wasn't there. I looked around for her, and I did find her, but I couldn't trigger the next event. So that was enough Varkana for me.
I did make it further in the game, and I can tell you what happens, and it's not very satisfying, although some of it is interesting. So what happens in the finale is that when this ambassador goes and steals the book, suddenly it's revealed that he is a magician of some sort who's got mind control powers, and he mind controls Faranaz, the main character, and then suddenly you, the player, get bumped out of her point of view and into the point of view of Nivanen, who is a guard, and she's also Faranaz's best friend, who happens to be in the scene there too. And suddenly the game turns from stop this guy from stealing the book to now you're this guard who's trying to save her friend who's been kidnapped. And at that point, you get a big chase sequence, which ends in this warehouse where you're getting on this flying machine. And at that point, that's where it fractures into the possibility for different endings. And those different endings all hinge on how helpful you are to this man in helping him escape with this book he's stolen and with your mind-controlled best friend. And it's extremely confusing because at that point in the story, you're rewarded the most if you're extremely helpful to him. If you get him out with lots of time to spare before the guards get there and shoot down the flying machine, only after you've gotten him out do you get your little epilogue, giant data dump backstory, where in the best ending, he tells you in the epilogue, after you've already made all your decisions, that it turns out that he wanted this book for altruistic reasons. And you find out that his order of magicians work with astral travelers. And sometime in his past, he was working with an astral traveler priestess who, while she was aiding him, some other magician burst into the room and attacked her and therefore left her stranded on the astral plane. And he felt so bad about the fact that she suffered this consequence because of him that now he's on a quest to round up several magical items that might possibly bring her home. And the poetry book is one of them. But the problem is that if someone repairs the poetry book, it will lose its magic and will no longer work for saving this woman. And it turns out that Faranaz's mentor, who's referred to at the start of the game, hates this magician for some reason and commanded Faranaz to repair this book on purpose to make it not magical, just to be a dick, I guess. And that's the story you get after the fact. And when I hit that point in the game, I was like, what? Why are we suddenly getting an entirely different story than the one that we've been in after the entire game is over? And I have a lot of questions about that.
That sounds like it could be a good idea for a game. Unfortunately, I gather that instead we get 200 moves of you are in a place, picking ribbons out of bushes and grabbing cats, and then apparently you sit down and read a non-interactive short story?
I'm reminded of one piece of writing advice I've always loved, which is that you should always show your reader the cool thing. You shouldn't hide what the point of your story is just to build tension for the reader and with the expectation that the cool thing should only show up at the very end. For me, what bothered me about this in particular is that, like, part of the whole satisfaction of this ending is the fact that, you have to know that apparently magic exists and apparently mind control exists and apparently astral travelers exist somewhere. And like, it's not satisfying if you just get it in the epilogue. To me, I'm like, why wasn't that in the game somewhere for me to discover, even if it was hidden, if that was load bearing to the ending of the game? It relies on all this information that you're given about this villain's true motivations. And you don't get to see the cool thing on screen. You don't get all the rules established up front so you can enjoy the conclusion. You just kind of feel like that you missed the game, or that maybe you were playing through a point of view that didn't really pay off or matter so much. When it was over, I was like, man, I kind of wish I'd gotten to play as the mind control powers magician. Like, that would have been a really cool mechanic, and it could have been really fun to commit this heist because he had agency in the plot and he actually got to do something cool and was a little bit more in the know about the sides of the story that would have made it really fun for me as the player to go through this plot.
Well, I've pretty much scraped bottom in terms of what I have to say about this game, so final thoughts?
I just found it really vanilla. It was very pleasant, but nothing that I found really memorable. Like, maybe by contrast with the last game that I talked about on this show, The Baron, that one I found really challenging, and maybe it didn't entirely work for me, but man, I'm going to remember that game because it tackled something that I found intellectually interesting, and I felt like it took some risks. But this one just felt like its setting just kind of pleasant but safe, and the gameplay itself confusing, and the payoff wasn't very satisfying for me.
I think that what most sums up the game for me is that the game describes people licking their fingers after turning the kingberries into ink. So I tried drinking the kingberry juice to see what kind of vivid description I would get, evoking all the different flavor notes of this scrumptious beverage, and the game replied, "You take a small sip. It's very tasty," which is about as close as you can get to, "It is very nice." And that wraps it up for Ask Tell number 16. Thanks to my guests, Amy Hill and Rachel K. Jones, and to the authors of the games, Victor Heispers and Mariam Goucher-Forgeot. It's looking like this will be the first of 3 shows focusing on the games of 2007, and I hope to get all 3 of them out this summer, but we'll see how everything shakes out. In any case, thanks for listening, and bye for now.